Rambam in Acharonim to the Yad says that the Talmud Bavli is the last authoritative source, since the whole Jewish people accepted the authority of the Talmud Bavli. It seems that the derech of the Rambam and the Rishonim was to analyze and understand what's the halacha when looking at the Talmud Bavli, since that's the authoritative source. So the Rav shed light on and explained how halachic analysis seems to have changed over time. It's now much more analyzing, like if one looks in the Mishnah Berurah, you've got this Acharon, that Acharon, and sort of weighing up different Acharonim when in actual fact.
Yeah. A very, very fundamental, it's a very, very, very good question, very difficult question, and it's not clear that there's a simple answer to it. But let's start off with a simple question. Like everybody learns, everybody understands that the Talmud Bavli is the final source of halacha. And a Tana, an Amora cannot argue with a Tana. We learn as children, as soon as we start learning Torah, whatever age we start learning Torah. We have a certain hierarchy. An Amora cannot argue with a Tana, and a Rishon cannot argue with an Acharon, except for the Vilna Gaon, who got a special license that he was allowed to argue with an Acharon, with a Rishon, and the like. So let's start off with a very basic idea. Now, the Torah says in Parsha Shoftim, the din of Loisosar, and that is when you have a Sanhedrin of 71, then the Torah says whatever their interpretation of the Torah is binding on everybody, even if you're a Talmid Chacham, even if you're a Lamdan, even if you're a person who thinks you know better than the Sanhedrin, you are mechuyev al pi din to follow the decision of the Sanhedrin. This is al pi ha-Torah asher yarucha v'al ha-mishpat asher yamar l'chus haseh leisasar mikol asher yagidu l'cha. Now the Ramban does say that if you are a person who's on the Madrega to be on the Sanhedrin and you weren't there, maybe you're not mechuyev privately to listen to them, because you could make the argument that if I would present my argument, they would be makabel it. But even if that's so, that's only a heter for you. That's not a heter to teach anybody else. You're not allowed to teach anybody keneged the Sanhedrin. So when you have a decision of the Sanhedrin, that is final and that is binding. Now, here's the thing. Many psukim in the Mishnah do date from a time when there still was a Sanhedrin. Rav Yehuda Hanassi was the head of a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was nimshach many years after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. The Sanhedrin does not depend on a Beis HaMikdash. It depends on smicha, the unbroken line of ordination. And that did continue several hundred years after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, till at some point the Romans killed the last person who had smicha, so he couldn't give smicha. Now, that actually means, therefore, that it seems that based on the dynamics of Loisasor, any interpretation that is offered by a Chacham that is not rooted in a decision of the Sanhedrin is just an interpretation. It's just an opinion. It is not binding on me, meaning I'm not mechuyev to, theoretically, to listen to an Amora. I'm not mechuyev to listen to a Rishon. I'm certainly not mechuyev to listen to an Acharon. So the mystery is, what creates the binding force of Talmud Bavli? I know I'm restating your question, because the Talmud Bavli, compiled by Ravina and Ravashi and really hundreds of other people, they were the editors-in-chief. There was no Sanhedrin at that time. There was no Sanhedrin. So what makes it binding? So the Rambam is machadesh, a very, very interesting thing. The Rambam says, since all of Klal Yisrael accepted the Talmud Bavli as an authoritative source of halacha, that makes it binding not only on them, but on all of the generations. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is absolutely a chiddush. This is not anything that's entirely clear. Mehechi tesi, where are you going to see that? Because we were makabel. Now, there are really two questions. Question number one is, was everybody makabel? There were quite a few Jews who weren't makabel. There were Jews called the Karaites. The Karaim were not makabel. Today, certainly, 90% of the Jewish people are not makabel the Talmud Bavli as authoritative. So what are you going to say? You get into very sticky, very thin ice. It's, well, we only mean the legitimate Jews. All the legitimate, this is called in logic, the no true Scotsman argument, and that is, well, Klal Yisrael was Makabel. You weren't Makabel, you're not Klal Yisrael, right? So Mamela, by definition, Klal Yisrael was Makabel. So that's one issue, meaning where do you find Klal Yisrael was Makabel? Second issue is, even if they were Makabel, how does that create an equivalence to a Sanhedrin that's Mechayev all the future Deiros? Very interesting question. It could very well be that the Rambam understands that the obligatory nature of Torah Shabbal Peh parallels Kabbalah's HaTorah itself. How did the Jews accept the Torah? It's very, very fascinating. Even look at the phrase Kabbalah's HaTorah, acceptance of the Torah. Why is there Kabbalah? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the boss, and he commands you to keep the Torah. What? Kabbalah? Got to accept the Torah? So, there was some Inyan that Klal Yisrael as a nation accepted Hashem's Torah, and that was a binding commitment to all the future generations. The Rambam is understanding Torah Shabbal Peh works the same way with the Kabbalah. But it's a big chiddush. It is not at all a simple point. So that's why the Rambam says nobody could argue with what the Gemara says. Now granted, the Gemara itself has many, many opinions. So there's plenty of room for argument, but you can't just say, I think the Gemara is wrong, right? You can't say, oh, I don't like the interpretation that Rav Ashi gives to this Mishnah. I prefer to give my interpretation. That's not shaykh, because Kiblu, Klal Yisrael was Makabel. Okay, even though empirically there's some problems. Okay, so the question that you're raising is that if you look in contemporary halachic Sfarim, it is very, very rare that a posek will simply look at the Gemara and say, well, based on the Gemara, this is how we have to paskin. They will look at Acharonim, they'll look at very recent people and debate, well, Rav Moshe says this, and Rav of Yeshivas says this, and Rav Shlomo Zalman says this. So the emissaries, the Vilna Gaon actually writes that if you are in the category of a chacham shehigia l'hayra, which is hard to define, but that means a chacham, a wise person, a scholar of Torah, who has reached the level that you're able to paskin. So you don't have to even follow the Shulchan Aruch. You go to the Gemara, the interpretations of the Gemara, and you're machriya. That's why the Vilna Gaon held, he told Rav Chaim Volozhiner, a chacham she'egiel l'hayra is not even mechayiv to follow the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was his opinion as to what the halacha is, but we go back to the Gemara. So the truth of the matter is, that's exactly how the process should work. The reason it doesn't work is because niskatnu adeiris, since we've gotten smaller and smaller over time, so we have a certain, maybe well-deserved humility in not considering ourselves as great as those earlier generations. So therefore, in a sense, instead of coming to our own decision, we want to look around and see what is the consensus of those who came before us. But Eino Chinami, it is not the highest level of psak. I think I had mentioned last week or the week before that if you compare the styles in halacha between, let's say, Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Moshe Feinstein, you see a very, very interesting difference. Rav Ovadia Yosef, who had an amazingly photographic memory, just unbelievable, would go through every Sheila Utshuva that was ever written. I mean, I'm talking about maybe hundreds of things. And he'll then count them. I mean, I'm caricature a little bit. I don't want to say anything not lefi chavodo. But he would say, okay, let's go through 150 svarim that have discussed this shaila. I've gone through 150 svarim, usually by memory, and I can tell you 135 say this way, and 15 say that way. Therefore, the 135 people got it, because I've gone through everything. If you look at Igros Moshe, you will find that Rav Moshe almost never quotes Acharonim at all. In fact, the Acharonim that he quotes, you can actually count more or less on one hand. I don't want to say for sure, but he'll quote the Chassam Sofer, the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the Aruch HaShulchan. It's only 4, maybe the Pischei Tshuva, which is on the Shulchan Aruch itself. And Rav Moshe even writes, when people often will write in a tshuva, oh, they showed me this sefer and that sefer, I don't even have it, I don't have that sefer, but they showed it to me, and I disagree. Often they'll say, I just disagree with it. So Rav Moshe was someone who was obviously Higiel L'Hayra, and he went back to the Gemara itself. He would go back to the Gemara and to the Rishonim, which are interpreting the Gemara, and be Machriya Halacha. Rav Ovadia who was certainly Higil Hara too, no question about it, but he felt it's better to look at what the Kadmainim say. So all I would say is that it's not that the Acharonim supersede the Gemara. I mean, fakert. I mean, ultimately, if you go back to the Acharonim, they're based on the Rishonim. The Rishonim are based on interpretation of the Gemara. So really, everything is based on the Gemara. Elamai, instead of making our own independent judgments, we go back and how other people did it. It's simply anava. And listen, for the vast majority of us, I include myself, that is the better way to go. I mean, I'm not going to sit around. I mean, if you're going to ask me let's take a very simple example. Do I have the right to argue with Rav of Yeshivas psak? Let's assume Rav of Yeshiv said a certain thing, and there's no one who argues with him, let's say. And I learned the sugya, and I think, I don't think Rav of Yeshiv is right here. Do I have the right to be cholek and Rav of Yeshiv? I absolutely have the right to be cholek and Rav of Yeshiv. He's not a Sanhedrin. He's not a Tana. He's not an Amora. Why can't I argue with Rav of Yeshiv? Not only do I have the right, you have the right. Elamai, but it would be a stupid thing to do. It would be a foolish thing to do. I have the right to argue, but what is the probability that I got it right and he got it wrong? Not so great. So a lot of this is based on this very idea, meaning if you're asking me, can we be cholek on Acharonim? The answer is sure. In fact, we might even be able to be cholek on Rishonim, actually. But it makes no sense. I mean, let's imagine, I'll give you a secular example. Let's imagine that, I took my undergraduate course in physics, and I'm convinced that Albert Einstein didn't really understand relativity. No. And I say, Einstein got it wrong. The real meaning of relativity is so-and-so. Now, do I have the right to express my opinion? Yeah. Could it be that I'm right and Einstein is wrong? Yes, it could be. But what are the probabilities? Is it a sensible assumption to make? It's not a sensible assumption. So that's kind of where the halachic process works. It's simply a question of looking at our madrega and saying, these guys knew better than us, these people knew better than us, and we should be mevatel our daas. But the real yesod of psak is to go back to the Gemaras. This was the derech of Moshe Feinstein, the Chazon Ish, the great, the Vilna Gaon, of course, who actually said that if you're a yachid shegiel lahira, you're bechlal not bound by the Shulchan Aruch at all. Okay, so it's a complicated question. By the way, the Rambam himself, who basically said, Talmud Bavli is the yesod of all halacha because kiblu kol Yisrael. That's why the Rambam felt free. The Rambam held he was not bound by the Gaonim. Even though we often say a Rishon should not argue on Gaonim, the Rambam did not hold to that rule. The Rambam held Rishon, that he could argue with Gaonim. But still, the Rambam was not fully consistent because even though the Rambam does articulate that the Bavli is the final source, there are kama v'kama makaimes where the Rambam paskins like the Talmud Yerushalmi over the Talmud Bavli. So it's like Talmud Bavli wins except when it doesn't. And the Meforshim try to develop rules. When would the Rambam allow the Yerushalmi to be machriya over the Bavli? So it's a mysterious question a little bit. The authority of the Gemara itself is not a pashut. Again, it's axiomatic that that authority exists. I'm not questioning, God forbid, I'm not questioning that. But the yesod hadvarim is not at all a davar pashut. Yeah.
Here's a sentence. In the ending section of Birkat HaMazon, what is the significance of the switch between magdil for weekdays and migdol for Shabbat and other special days? Since these two words are so phonetically similar, it causes one to wonder if they were not at one time merely two different gersas.
Yes. This is interesting. We know that on Shabbos, one of the differences in the Birkat HaMazon is that during the week we say magdil Yeshuos Malko, magdil Yeshuos, God increases, or the king increases the salvation. So it's a verb. Magdil is a verb, to increase, to make great. And on Shabbos, it becomes migdol, a tower. It becomes a noun. A tower of salvation is God. So first, let me point out the obvious. These are actually two versions of a pasuk in Nach, one in the book of Shmuel and one in the book of Tehillim, which record a song or a poem that David HaMelech composed. And the song is virtually identical in Sefer Shmuel and in Sefer Tehillim, right? Except the only thing is, in Shmuel it says magdil, and in Tehillim, I'm sorry, the other way. In Tehillim it says magdil, and in Shmuel it says migdol. So the issue that these are two different gersos is 100% correct, because in Tanakh these are two different psukim. Now, so the question then becomes, so why in benching do we incorporate one nusach during the week and one nusach on Shabbos? So one answer, which is a simple answer, is that you often find this in other liturgical matters. This is not going to be a satisfying answer, but it could very well be that when there are multiple readings of things, so the Mesadrei HaTfilah try to say, okay, let's do it. We want to use everything. In fact, Sim Shalom and Shalom Rav. The original idea was that Shalom Rav in the Yerushalmi was an alternative nusach for Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. And Sim Shalom was the nusach for everything, Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. And then they decided, let's make both, let's incorporate them. Even during Yomim Noraim, even though the minig of the Gra is Serer Shemei Tshuva, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we don't say Birkat Hashem Osei HaShalom. We say Hamavarech Es Hamo Yisrael B'Shalom all the time. But many Ashkenazim do have the minhag of, outside of Eretz Yisrael, that we say Oseh HaShalom instead of Hamavarech Es Hamo Yisrael B'Shalom, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Serer Shemei Tshuva. There too, Oseh HaShalom was a standardized nusach for the whole year in the Yerushalmi. So you often find the idea that when there's a machlokas of nuschos, you simply find a place to use both of them. But there are deeper reasons, more spiritually satisfying, and that is magdil, which is a verb, connotes an active process. God is increasing his Yeshua. You know, you're down here, and God is giving you more and more and more and more salvation. That is an appropriate lashon for the 6 days of creation, where God is creating new things. He's magdil the Yeshua. Shabbos is menucha. Shabbos, you experience me'ein olam haba. In olam haba, Hashem is not magdil, he's a migdol. He is a tower. It's there. He's there, meaning it's not you're getting more and more and more and more and more, but rather that is the completion. So migdol is a lashon that connotes completion and closure. Magdil is an ongoing process. So chol is an ongoing process of building. Migdol is the final product that you get. But again, I want to emphasize, the origin of these is Shmuel versus Tehillim. Both readings do appear. Now, I've mentioned before the fascinating son of the Aruch HaShulchan, one of the great poskim, Rav Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein, Aruch HaShulchan, who had a son who was also a well-known Talmud Chacham, Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein. And Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein wrote also many svarim, the most famous of which is the Torah Tamima. You can see it in the Beis Medrash downstairs, which is a fascinating set of Chumashim and Megillos, where on every pasuk he gives you all the Gemaras on those psukim, and then he interprets them as well. Torah Tamima it's called, but he wrote many other things as well. One of the most interesting things he wrote, and he says he wrote it during World War I. He died in the Holocaust, but during World War I, he was isolated from svarim. He also had a tremendous, at least photographic memory or some type of wonderful memory. So he wrote a 4-volume biography and autobiography of his family. That's called Makor Baruch, the source of Baruch. His name was Baruch, the source of Baruch. So 1 volume is on his father, and 1 volume is on the Nitziv, who was his uncle. Different things. And in there, he has all sorts of divrei Torah that he was machadesh, kind of very unusual observations. So he says the following vort that he said. He wanted to suggest that the whole idea that on Shabbos you say migdol was an incorrect deciphering of a Rashi Teva. He says the nusach of benching was magdil, and that was true for the week, and that was true for Shabbos. But printers put in parentheses, Beis Shin Aleph, migdol. And that actually meant Ubishmuel Isa. In the book of Shmuel, it says migdol. But some later printer deciphered that abbreviation, Ubeshabes Omrim. Instead of Ubeshmuel Omer, it was Ubeshabes Omrim. And based on the incorrect deciphering of the abbreviation, it became, on Shabbos we say migdol. So he told his father that the Chiddush, he told his father the Aruch HaShulchan that Lanias Daitai, this was an incorrect pinuach of a Rashi Teva. So he says, his father said, it's a good word, but you should stick to the minhag. Say migdol anyway. don't change the halacha. So there actually is a speculation that indeed it may have been a mistake. But again, as I say, I think the normal understanding is magdil is an ongoing process. Migdol is a finished product. Yeah.
When we are hosting a Shabbos meal or Pesach Seder, and we invite our Jewish friends or cousins, they might also ask to bring along their non-Jewish boyfriends and girlfriends too. We tell them that their Jewish partners might not feel comfortable at such an intense Jewish experience. They might retort, why can't you be more open-minded and accepting? How should we respond to this challenge?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different questions here, inviting non-Jews. So first of all, let me start off with one very interesting point that the Gemara in Maseches Beis says, which may be counterintuitive. The Gemara says you are allowed to invite a non-Jew to a Shabbos meal. You want to experience a Shabbos? You're not allowed to invite a non-Jew to a Yom Tov meal. Lav Dafka Seder, any Yom Tov meal. Now the question is, well, why is that? Shabbos is holier than Yom Tov. If I could invite a non-Jew to a Shabbos meal, why can't I invite a non-Jew to a Yom Tov meal? So the Gemara says, the problem is, Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook. But you're not allowed to cook for a non-Jew. You're only allowed to cook for a Jew. So on Shabbos, where I'm not allowed to cook, if I invite a non-Jew, I'm not going to cook for the non-Jew, so it's going to be okay. On Yom Tov, what is the fear? Since I'm cooking for other people, for other Yidden, I might make extra food for the guy, and that is a desecration of Yom Tov. Now, that would be a doraisa. To actually cook for the guy would be a doraisa violation. The Chachamim made a gezerah, don't even invite. Now, I want to point out that that's not miyuchad to Pesach. That would actually mean any Yom Tov meal, unless it's a Yom Tov which is also Shabbos, would be usher. Now, let me stop right there. That already raises some very, very difficult problems. I mean, let's take a very simple situation. Let's imagine you have a non-Jewish person who is in the process of converting to Judaism. And he's sincere. So you're telling me I can't invite him to a Seder, I can't invite him to a Yom Tov meal? How is he going to learn? How is he going to experience these things? So I will tell you, the Acharonim bend over backwards to be lenient here, meaning any possible reason to be lenient. The tendency of halacha is to be extremely mekel, and they'll say, for example, if you have prepared all of your food beforehand and you're not doing any cooking for the Jews, you'd be allowed to have it. That's one line of heter. Another line of heter is that if he's a friend of a Jew, so you're inviting the Jew and he comes along, that would be another. So the tendency of halacha is to be very, very mekel. So that's one issue of inviting people to a Yom Tov meal. Now, there's another issue, and that is there let's assume that you're going to be lenient for Sudat Yom Tov. Is there a reason to be stricter for a Pesach Seder? Because after all, the Pesach Seder is to commemorate the eating of the Korban Pesach. That's what it is. Right? Yashka's Last Supper was a Pesach Seder, right? You look at Da Vinci. Of course, Da Vinci didn't hold of the Chazon Ish's shir in the famous painting of the Last Supper. There are 4 cups of wine on the table, although not everybody had it. Maybe he held like Taisus. One person could be mitzi. But the cups are very small. So again, Leonardo is not a posek. We can't bring a raya from him. But apparently he held that the shir didn't have to be very big. But it was a Pesach Seder, Pashat. The Last Supper was a Pesach Seder. Now the problem is, this is, of course, in those days they were eating the Korban Pesach. No, by that time they weren't. There was shortly after the Korban Beis HaMikdash. But okay. No, it was before. It was before the Korban. So they were eating the Korban Pesach. That's right. Okay. Now, the Torah says by the Korban Pesach very specifically, Kol ben nechar lo yaichal bay. a non-Jew is not allowed to participate in the eating of the Korban Pesach. So some want to say there's a special svara that even when you have a heter to invite a non-Jew, either because it's a conversion or because he's coming along with a Jew, Pesach Seder is different because kol ben nechel lo yechal bay. But mi'ikar adin, that's not a chisaron either, because halachically that only applies to Korban Pesach. And therefore halachically a Seder is no different than a Seudas Yom Tov. So if there is a heter for Seudas Yom Tov, and you have to talk to a rabbi about it, there will be a heter for the Seder as well. Now, so one issue is inviting a guy for a Yom Tov meal. Another issue is inviting a guy for a Seder. A third issue, which unfortunately will come up a lot, when there's an intermarriage or a dating relationship, are you allowed to do something that is legitimating the By the way, that would apply to, the last thing would apply to a Shabbos meal and even a weekday meal. Are you legitimating? And that's a very, very difficult issue because it may very well depend. Because if this is a way that you could be makarev them and perhaps encourage the non-Jew to consider I don't mean a fake conversion, but to consider a conversion, there would be a makom to be lenient, right? So that depends on a case-by-case basis. So b'kitzur, these are the three halachic issues that you have to face: Sudas Yom Tov, Leil Seder, and being mechazek, strengthening people who are pursuing a sin by legitimating the relationship. Now, sof kol sof, there are grounds to be lenient in all of them if there's a positive toelis. Now, the point that you specifically raised, that maybe the Seder is something they're not going to understand, so this really depends. This is an issue. It all depends. A lot of the Seder can be very, very meaningful to a non-Jew as well. Right? Obama used to make Seders at the White House and whatever it would be. Now, the problem is, of course, if they're still around after benching and we open the door and say, pour your wrath upon the nations that don't know you, etc., that might be a time to ask them, kind of have them leave after the meal or whatever it would be. So there may be issues that are hard to understand. But most of the narrative of Yetzias Mitzrayim is something that's worthy for non-Jews to think about as well. That God cares about the Jewish people, that God punishes evil, that injustice eventually becomes accountable. These are universal ideas that B'nai Noach should know about as well. And therefore, Pesach has a relevance even to B'nai Noach. I wouldn't automatically exclude them, provided you work within the halachic parameters that you have to work within. Yeah.
I understand there's a precedent that when you injure someone, you should pay for their medical treatment.
Yeah.
Does this also apply if they have medical insurance?
Yes, that's a very excellent question. The halacha is, right, that if you injure somebody, you hit somebody, you hurt them in an accident, you're chovel b'chavero, so you're chayav 5 things. You're chayav for, if there's a loss of limb, you're chayav to compensate for a loss of limb. You're chayav for lost wages. You're chayav for pain. You're chayav for humiliation, embarrassment, if there is. And you are chayav for ripoy. You are chayav for medical expenses because it costs money to get medical expenses. In fact, by the way, the Gemara of Kama Darshan Shmeir, this is how we know you're allowed to go to a doctor. I would have a hava, only God can heal you, and you're not allowed to go to a doctor. The Torah says, no, you're allowed to go to a doctor. That's called tishtadlus, and that's why the guy has to pay medical expenses, because you're allowed to go to a doctor. Otherwise, it's interesting, otherwise we would have been like Christian Scientists, not allowed to go to a doctor. Okay, so the question becomes, am I mechuyev to pay medical expenses if there is insurance? So let me give you a parallel question. Let's move away from Ruvain hitting Shimon. Let's talk about property. Let's simply imagine that I totaled your car. I borrowed your car, I totaled it, or I simply got angry and I took a sledgehammer and I destroyed your property. So for shteitzach, I'm chayiv to pay. I'm chayiv to pay. Am I chayiv to pay if you have insurance and you suffered no loss? I destroyed a $1,000 computer, whatever it would be, but you have homeowner's insurance. You get $1,000. Do I have to pay you? So machlokas haposkim, the Or Sameach, the Meshech Chachma, actually says that if I damage your property, I have to pay you the value of the property, even if you have insurance that compensates you, because I destroyed your property that's worth $1,000. This is an interesting conceptual idea. The chiyuv of paying for the destruction of property is not because I caused you loss. It's because I destroyed your property. You see the difference? So even if there's no loss because you're getting insurance money, I destroyed $1,000 of your property. So the Meshech Chachma says, in effect, I benefit from your damaging my property because now I get $2,000, right? I had $1,000 and you destroyed it, so I get $1,000 from you and I get $1,000 from my insurance. Now, this is a psak, and Lamaisa, I see that the poskim in modern times follow the Or Sameach, and they basically say a mazik of property is chayev to pay even if there is insurance money. Now, the question then becomes, now we get to your question, the question becomes, will I apply that same bit of logic to medical expenses? Meaning, if I destroy your computer, I got to pay you even if you get insurance. So would I say, if I broke your arm, I got to pay your medical expenses even though you get insurance? I think there is a chiluk. I'd have to see for sure, and I can't give you a definitive psak, but I do think that the difference is when I destroy property, I'm chayev to pay because I destroyed your property. So even if you get compensated, I destroyed your property. With medical insurance, the whole chiyuv is to pay the expenses that you're incurring. That is the definition of the chiyuv. If you're not incurring the expenses, then those are not your expenses. So for example, let's assume there's a deductible, which is common. Right? Whatever it is, there's a $500 deductible. So eino chinami. Deductible means the part you have to pay before your insurance pays in. So yeah, your medical expenses are $500. They're not $5,000 because you don't have to pay them. But the $500 deductible, for sure. Right, so I do think that the Meshech Chach, or the Or Sameach's psak regarding damaging property would actually not apply to the medical insurance situation, and I would think that you would not have to pay whatever is covered by insurance. An interesting question is, would you have to pay the increase in premium? That's an interesting question, meaning let's imagine because I broke your arm and your medical insurance kicked in, your insurance premium is higher. Would we treat the increase in the premium as a medical expense, meaning because you broke your arm, your insurance went up, whatever it is, $25 a month? I'm not sure because you're not really paying for the medical treatment, you're paying for future insurance protection. But maybe it's shaykh that might be nichlal in the obligation of repay. It's a good question, yeah.
Here's another send-in. Is there an inyan to forgive someone who wronged you if that person has no remorse and did not do teshuvah? If so, why are we expected to be seemingly more forgiving than Hashem, who minimally requires teshuvah? If you do forgive such a person, do they have an obligation to appease you, or only to do teshuvah bin adam lamakom?
Yep, so the question becomes, are you obligated to forgive somebody, to be mochel somebody, who has no remorse, no regrets, and no desire to do tshuva? Let's take that question first. The answer halachically is you're absolutely not obligated. It's very, very clear that when the Rambam discusses the notion of being mochel a person, forgiving a person, and you're mechuyev to forgive a person if he has asked repeatedly, all of that is presupposing not only has he asked your mechila, but you can gauge, you never know, that he is sincere and has genuine remorse for what he's done. If a person does not do tshuva, does not show remorse, does not communicate mechila, you are not does not communicate bakashas mechila, request for mechila, you're not mechuyev to forgive him. Now, there is, however, another inyan to keep in mind. there is something that Chazal call mavir al midosav. Mavir al midosav means you forego your entitlements. Meaning a midah is what I'm entitled to. I'm entitled to a certain measure. I'm entitled to something, and I'm not getting it, but I'm willing to forego. Now, mavir al midosav is not an obligation. It's going beyond the halacha, but Chazal say mavir al midosav has very, very precious gifts, because it says God will deal with you the way you deal with others. And again, in the Talmud Devorah, we've seen this over and over again. And that is, if you're willing to forego what you're entitled to, Hashem is willing to forego what he's entitled to in terms of punishment for Averos. So it's a great, great midas chasidus, generally, to forgive people, even if they have not asked for forgiveness, and even if they have not sought tshuva. It is not required in that way. Now, the question you ask is, if you have forgiven a person and they have not done anything, are they still mechuyev to try to appease you? Are they still mechuyev to ask for your forgiveness? Or do they thus do tshuva with God and the like? So the Svarim seem to say there actually is a chiyuv to ask mechila, even if they've been forgiven, because there's still a bein adam lechavero in terms of the pain that they caused, and part of the forgiveness from God depends on working it out with that person. So there still would be a chiyuv. And again, the way the Meforshim explain, the idea of asking mechila is not simply to be forgiven, because if that would be the only purpose, you've been forgiven already. But it's also to lower yourself. Part of your atonement is the humility of having to go to the person and say that you're sorry. And that chiyuv does not go away, even with that person's forgiveness. In other words, if bakashas mechila would only be to get mechila, then you're right. There would be an argument that if the guy forgave me, I don't have to go. But if it's to be mashpil myself, to lower myself, to subjugate myself, that chiyuv would still exist. Now, let me point out, there is another perspective on this, meaning, so essentially what my answer to the question is, you don't have to forgive people who are not trying to do tshuva, but it's a midas chasidus to forgive them. But let me point out that sometimes it works the other way. Sometimes, if you want them to learn, you want them to take musar, you need to be tough. It's the other way around, meaning to say, maybe internally you should forgive them, but externally you want them to ask mechila. So therefore, sometimes you need to take the other stance that says, you have to ask mechila, you have to ask forgiveness. This is why you find in the Gemara a number of cases, one case even involving Yashka himself, in which Yashka did something not proper in front of his Rebbe, and he was asking forgiveness from his Rebbe for many, many days. The Rebbe didn't want to forgive him because he wanted Yashka to keep on asking. Of course, the Gemara says the story didn't end very well, because he was going for many, many days, and finally the Rebbe said, okay, today I'm going to forgive him. And Yashka said, if he doesn't forgive me today, I'm leaving. And it happened to be that the Rebbe was in the middle of Birchas Kriya Shema, whatever. He couldn't interrupt. I don't know why Yashka didn't know that. And Yashka said, that's it. And he kind of left Torah, and he went off the derech, and he went to Egypt, and he became a sorcerer and a magician, and the rest we know is the history of Christianity in various ways. But still, the cheshbon of the Rebbe in not forgiving him, although the Gemara says the Rebbe was too tough. It does say the Rebbe was too tough. This is an example of the famous statement that you're makarev people with your right hand, meaning the stronger hand should draw people near. The weaker hand should repel, and this Rebbe was too disciplinary, too harsh, but the idea of a certain amount of harshness and discipline is an important idea, because that's how people learn that they're accountable for their actions, right? If you simply forgive indiscriminately, people will never learn. So it's a difficult balance. On one hand, we have mavir al midaisav. Be mavatir. Give up. Be mochel. Don't insist on things. Don't demand that people beg your forgiveness. On the other hand, It's part of your responsibility to him that you bring him to a place where he does a sincere tshuva, right? So you got to balance the two things. And this is the other chazal as well. Now love him are those who are shamed and humiliated. V'einam ovim, but they don't humiliate in return. So they are given a tremendous reward. So you got to do it both things at the same time. Yeah.
So the question is, in today's day and age, where like therapy and like mental health and things is very popular. How does that apply to a child's relationship with their parent? Like if someone and keep it up. So like in terms of if you notice in a parent an attribute or something that you think that potentially could need some therapy, or in terms of expressing yourself because of your healing process to your parent, which would fall in line with keep it up. How does that kind of?
Yeah. So the question becomes with the advent of therapy, and many people are seeking different help for mental health struggles. How does that intersect with kibbud aviyim? So let me mention a few things. Number one, if you're going to a therapist and you need to discuss different conflicts that you are facing, even if you have to talk about your parents in terms of things that may be a little negative, that is called lashon hara l'tayeles. That is revealing of denigrating information for a positive purpose of restoring your mental and emotional health, and you are allowed to do that. Certainly, if you're dealing with a one-to-one therapist, you can tell your therapist anything, and don't worry about lashon hara. Where things get a little complicated, even in that situation, is when you have group therapy sessions. This is indeed a very serious problem, where let's assume I'm a therapist and I'm meeting with 10 guys, and each of them are talking about horror stories, about their parents and the like, and everybody is commenting on everybody's story. Now, it's one thing, I tell the therapist something bad my parents did to me, and that therapist helps me deal with it, but is that a heter to talk about it in a group of 9 or 10 or 20 people? Or do we go with the idea that they become co-therapists, meaning to say the group therapy is part of the refuah? That is a very serious question. The issue of group therapy and lashon hara is a serious shaila that's not automatically going to be nichlal in the single therapist. Now, I know you didn't particularly ask about that. So you asked about what? Telling your parent that, hey, Dad, you need to go to a psychiatrist?
Right. So either possibly suggesting to a parent that because the younger generations are more in tune with these things, suggest to a parent, or
yeah. So this is nichlal, I would think, in the area that halacha talks about, which I think has an analogy, is what do you do if you see your parent doing something wrong, doing an aveira, right? How do you give musar to your parent? So you got to do it in a very derech eretz way. You basically say, Dad, I had learned in maybe I'm wrong, but I had learned in yeshiva that you're not supposed to do this. So I'm just mentioning it, and I don't know if I'm right or not. You do so with humility. You do so with derech eretz. So I think the truth of the matter is it's a delicate issue, and mom or dad may get very upset. You have to know, but if you bring it up in a kind and respectful way, you're offering it as a way of helping them. That, maybe you can get help this way. I know that life has a lot of stresses and things are tough, and sometimes the younger generation becomes aware of opportunities that, you may not know of. So it actually would be a mitzvah to bring the information to their attention. But you have to really think about a way of doing it which is not demeaning of them, which is respectful of them. Yeah.
And would that also apply if, in someone's healing process, it would be an expression to the parent of how things hurt them? Or
once again,
hold that aside?
yeah. So the emes is the way to do this is you actually ask their permission ahead of time, and then they're mochel. That's how it works halachically. Meaning you basically say, Mom and Dad, or Mom or Dad, I have something that's really bothering me, and it may hurt a little bit. Do I have your permission to talk to you about it? And then it's okay. If they say yes, then it is okay, because they gave you permission. But you actually have to ask them. you shouldn't start, first of all, you shouldn't scream even if you get permission, but you shouldn't just start dumping negative things on them. But you ask their rishus. By the way, there's an excellent, excellent book in English written by Rabbi Samet. Has anyone heard of Rabbi Samet doing okay? He's back already? Oh, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. So Rabbi Samet wrote 2 books. One is Judging People Favorably. That's the other side of the story, which is a great book. And the other is a book on kibbud avim, honoring parents. I was a little involved in that book. So if you get that book, she talks about a lot of these cases. It might be very helpful. Yeah.
I know there are those hashed and rehashed abortions. If you're wondering, I'm sure familiar with the Supreme Court ruling down in Bavli last week different IVF issues. I was just wondering if that really has the same meaning as abortion. What's the perspective on that? And what, I guess if the Rav could just give an overview of what that entails and how.
Yeah. This is a very, very amazing and really frightening case. The Supreme Court of Alabama, last week or 2 weeks ago, issued a ruling that unimplanted frozen embryos, meaning to say when you have an in vitro fertilization and the sperm fertilizes an egg, and it's in a freezer, it's not in a woman's body, have the status of human beings, and as a result, they have a right to life, they have a right to all sorts of things. This is kind of anti-abortion on steroids, meaning, 3 years ago, you were allowed to kill a baby in its 8th month, right? Abortion was the gamri mutter. So Trump's Supreme Court, and I would say Baruch Hashem, but Trump's Supreme Court said abortion is usher. Or at least, again, technically, you have to understand, the U.S. Supreme Court did not say abortion is prohibited. They simply said states are permitted to prohibit abortion, meaning it's up to every state. So in California and Massachusetts, abortion is still going to be allowed. But at least in the Deep South, this gave them a green light to prohibit abortion by overruling the infamous case of Roe versus Wade. So now, what you have is this. So now it's shayach that many, many states are going to or have prohibited abortion. But comes the Supreme Court of Alabama, and it goes one step further. Not only are we going to prohibit abortion of a baby in the mother's womb, but the frozen embryos are like babies already. Right? It's going much further than the Supreme Court itself. Now, let me just explain the following. You know that the immediate consequence of the Alabama Supreme Court's ruling was the virtual closing down of all in vitro fertilization clinics in the state of Alabama. I don't know how many there were. And the reason is very simple. It is the bread and butter of in vitro fertilization that when they extract eggs from a woman in order to fertilize them, they'll take 20 eggs because maybe 1 out of 20 will get fertilized. And if there's more eggs that are fertilized than implanted, those eggs will be frozen. And a frozen, it's not a frozen egg, it's a frozen embryo, could be used for later implantation, that's the easiest thing, or donated, or destroyed, or used for medical research. That's the legality of it. In Alabama, that would no longer be shayach. The only thing that would be allowed would be either donation to an infertile couple or implantation into the woman. Medical experimentation wouldn't be allowed. That also means stem cell research might not be allowed because stem cells involve taking material from embryos. They used to call it pre-embryos. Now they just call it frozen embryos. I don't know, for some reason they switched the term. Certainly Alabama wouldn't call it a pre-embryo because that's mashma. Okay, so the question becomes, what does halacha say about unimplanted embryos? All of us know, I don't want to rehash all of this, that as a general rule, halacha prohibits abortions unless the mother's life is in danger. That's going to be our assumption, right? That's a davar pashat. What is pikuach nefesh? What is not pikuach nefesh? We can debate. Psychological stress might be life-threatening, but the bottom line is, unless you can make it a pikuach nefesh situation, abortion is prohibited. Does halacha accord that same rule to an embryo that is not yet in the woman's body. So, as you might expect, it is a machlokas. Now, let me point out that there are some poskim who permit abortion of a fetus if it's under 40 days from conception. Now, if you follow the rule that a fetus, actually it's not called a fetus, but a fetus less than 40 days can be aborted, because the Gemara calls it mere water, then every frozen embryo, even if it's been there for 6 months, is developmentally less than 40 days. So then for sure it would be mutter. Right? So that's for sure. But if you would say that the issur of abortion is even pachais mimem yaim, so then you'd have a question, what is the status of the embryo? So many poskim say that even if you asur abortion less than 40 days, an externalized embryo that has not been implanted does not have the status of a human being. And as a result, you could thaw it, you can use it for stem cell research, you can use it for medical experimentation, and the like. So I think halacha would totally disagree with the Supreme Court of Alabama and would not give these embryos a right to life. I mean, you have to understand, this raises enormous questions. This makes in vitro IVF, in vitro fertilization technology, virtually impossible. In vitro, I'll call it IVF. IVF has helped hundreds of thousands of women, and in the Jewish community, in the Frum community, thousands of women. Thousands of women have had children through in vitro, which this type of opinion will not allow anymore. Let me point out another aspect of this, and this is the interesting issue of pre-implantation genetic screening. Let me give you an example. Many of you might have heard of an organization called Dor Yesharim. Dor Yesharim is a genetic screening organization within the Orthodox community in which if a boy and a girl are dating, or whatever it is, it kind of gives them genetic tests to see if they're compatible or they would create genetic risks. Now, it started with Tay-Sachs, and many people say it should have ended with Tay-Sachs. Now it expands everything, like, obesity or whatever it is. But let's go with Tay-Sachs, which is a real justification. Tay-Sachs is an awful childhood disease in which a child not only dies young, relatively young, but with a lot of suffering, blindness and paralysis and inability to breathe. And so far, things can change. It's like 100% fatal by 8 or 9. Often earlier than that, but 8 or 9. Now, in order to produce, as it were, a child with the disease, both parents have to be carriers of the gene. And if both parents are carriers of the gene, there's a 1 in 4 chance that they will have a child with the disease. If only one parent is a carrier, there's a 0 chance. But you need both parents to be carriers. So Dor Yesharim was started to deal with Tay-Sachs, in which a boy and a girl, they both do the testing, and they'll simply get back a message, compatible or incompatible. So what's the pshat? Compatible means either neither has the gene. See, there's no stigma. Either no one has the gene or one person has the gene. Incompatible means they both have the gene. And they made a whole point that they didn't want to stigmatize anybody. Now, of course, today, all of that is worthless because anybody can get a genetic test anywhere and they could find out themselves. But this dated from a time when the genetic testing was not available to the general public, so it was a specialized program. Now, here's the question. Again, this is a long-winded answer, but I think I'm going to say something that will be helpful to the question. Let's imagine you have a couple, and they didn't do Dor Yesharim, but they discover after they're married that both of them are Tay-Sachs carriers, and there's a 1 in 4 chance they will have a child with that awful, debilitating, fatal disease. Halachically, what is this couple supposed to do at that particular point? So I'm going to mention a few alternatives, and we'll see which ones might be acceptable. Alternative 1, get divorced. Well, halachically, that's permitted. It is halachically permitted to get divorced, but still, if you have a good and loving marriage, we wouldn't automatically want to encourage divorce. Okay. Option number 2, be married and be on permanent contraception. No children. Let us have a childless marriage. That is not halachically proper either. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to be fruitful and multiply. You can't simply decide deliberately that even though I'm physically able to have kids, I don't want to have kids. So divorce is not a great option. Permanent contraception is not a great option. Option number 3, let's wait until a pregnancy, and then we'll do amniocentesis. We'll, take the fluid from the amniotic fluid, and if it's a healthy baby, we'll go ahead with the delivery. If not, we will abort, meaning we'll do abortion if it's tay-sex. So here we actually come to a huge machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer of Oldenburg, the Tzitz Eliezer, actually permitted abortion of tay-sex babies until the 3rd trimester, meaning until 6 months. He felt this is such a tremendous pain for the child that this would justify the termination. Rav Moshe Feinstein and most other Gedolim considered this to be horrendously wrong, and Rav Moshe even says that God will have to forgive the Tzitz Eliezer for allowing this type of murder. So I would have to say that the general halachic consensus is abortion doesn't work. Okay. Option number 4, we might call the option of the tzaddikim. The tzaddik's option is, I will have kids, and what Hashem gives me, I will accept. After all, statistics are only statistics. Just because there's a 1 in 4 chance doesn't mean any of my kids will have the disease. And if a kid has the disease, kol ma di'avid rachamana l'tov avid, right? So we'll call that the option of the tzaddik, meaning to say, I'll do nothing. I will live my life the way a married couple lives their lives, and what Hashem gives is what Hashem gives. In many ways, that is the ideal situation after the fact. Nevertheless, many people emotionally are not able to live that way. For many people, it would crush them. And then we get into other questions. Okay, what about adoption? There are families that will take special needs children for adoption. Okay, but now I want to mention an option 5 that ties into your question. Option 5 is what is called pre-implantation genetic screening, meaning all pregnancies will be done through in vitro fertilization. And when the eggs are fertilized, they will be genetically scrutinized for various defects. And you will be able to tell the defect at that early embryo stage. If there is no defect, the eggs will be, I shouldn't call them the eggs, the embryos will be implanted. If there are defects, the embryos will not be implanted. This is called PGS, pre-implantation genetic screening. Under halacha, the poskim say that is permitted. Under the Alabama Supreme Court, it may very well be that would be a prohibited abortion. Okay, so you see the nafkaminas here. Now, of course, once you matter pre-implantation genetic screening, the question is that for any reason at all? Okay, I get if it's Tay-Sachs. What if it's Down syndrome? What if it's not the preferred gender? I want boys, get rid of those girls, or vice versa. In other words, if you're going with the idea that until the embryo is in the mother's body, there's no law of abortion, are you permitting termination of those embryos for any reason at all? Or does there have to be a good reason? And what is a good reason? Okay, those are good questions. But all I'm saying is it's a davar pashut. Halacha does not regard an unimplanted embryo as a human life for which there's an absolute abortion prohibition unless it's pikuach nefesh. Yeah.
On the topic of suicide,
Yeah.
I've heard it asked here before, and the answer is basically that Shulchan Aruch says that if somebody does it with daas, then then there's no shiva and there's no
Yeah.
Jewish cemetery, and we have earlier sources that indicate that somebody never really can do it purposefully, therefore we apply that. But what exactly, so nowadays, I think you said that, nowadays we always poskin that it's not done with daas. What then is the case that the Shulchan Aruch is talking about? Are we always saying that we're qualifying the Shulchan Aruch that it's not daas, and if so, what is daas?
Right, so the problem here, just to repeat the question, the problem is there's a category in halacha called ma'abed atzmo ladas. A person destroys themselves, a person takes their life intentionally. So, ein lo chelek leolam haba, there is no share in the world to come. We don't observe mourning for them. We don't sit shiva for them. They're not buried in the regular Jewish cemetery. They're buried a distance away from the other kavarim. And yet, there's an important qualification, which means, suicide is a very, very severe avera. Although I will raise a little question to you. Is suicide worse than murder, or is it just another form of murder? I mean, conceptually, if I were to ask you, what is the sin of suicide? As far as I know, the sin of suicide is murder. The same way I can't murder somebody else, I can't murder myself. So what's interesting is, though, that suicide seems to be treated worse than murder, because if I murder somebody else, I'm buried in a Jewish cemetery, as bad as that is, suicide not, So my question is, why would suicide, I understand why suicide is equal to murder. I'm not sure why suicide is worse than murder, unless the idea is that when you murder, you have the chance to do tshuva. By suicide, if you're successful, you died without tshuva. Oh, okay, I don't know. But putting that aside, the issue you're raising is based on a Sefer Hasidim. Rav Yehuda HaChassid writes that the rule that a suicide has no share in Olam Haba and a suicide we don't sit shiva only applies to a premeditated suicide where the person did not act out of depression and out of emotional turmoil, but where a person clearly was emotionally upset. They were in a state of temporary insanity. They are not responsible for their actions. Now, he's not saying every case is that way. He's saying a case. What modern poskim have done, and you're right, modern poskim have taken the Sefer Hasidim, who seems to have been talking about a small category of cases, and they have turned the exception into the rule. They have basically said, like a catch-22, well, yes, intentional suicides, we don't sit shiva, but people who act out of depression are not included in that. And if you weren't depressed, you wouldn't have committed suicide. So by definition, you must have acted under depression, and therefore we will not apply these particular sanctions. So I will tell you, I was a congregational rabbi for many years, and both me, who unfortunately had to deal with suicides, not among the members. My drushes weren't that long, but they had family members and the like who committed suicide or seemed to have taken their own life. I uniformly always ruled that the family should sit shiva, and it was my impression that this was the prevailing psak of Rabbanim, at least all over the United States. A very good example. We had a tragedy, was it a few years ago, with Chaim Walder? Again, I don't know if you know, whatever. Chaim Walder was a well-known children's author in the Haredi world, wrote beautiful, beautiful books, but it turned out that he was guilty of some very, very bad things. Again, that itself is a tragic story on many, many levels. And the story ended with Chaim Walder committing suicide in a cemetery next to the grave of a child who had predeceased him. So the whole thing was awful on so many levels. And yet what happened was there was a full shiva, there was a full levaya, there were even eulogies given, which again, that itself was very, very controversial. But the one thing is for sure is they didn't apply the suicide halachas to that situation. So the question you're asking is basically a very good question, and that is, if every single case, no matter what happens, you're always going to say it's from severe emotional distress, So if everything is the exception, then when do you ever have the rule? I mean, you never have the rule if every case, this is an exception that covers like 100% of the cases. So when are you going to apply the rule? It's very, very hard to know. It would seem that there are people sometimes who are, mentally fine, and they make a purely rational decision. Sometimes that they want to make room for other people in the earth or whatever it would be, and then we would apply that rule. But generally speaking, the way suicide works today, there's always going to be some emotional severity. That's always going to be the trigger. Now, let's take this guy. I mean, listen, it's a loss, to his family, obviously, but I can't help thinking what an idiot he is. The guy who burned himself in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., as a protest against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And, of course, Hamas, sent its condolences to the family. They consider him a great honor to go to Olam Haba. You're an honorary member of Hamas. I really wouldn't want to go to Olam Haba with that type of... but I think I don't know the story well, but I think that would be an example of a severe mental illness. I would not consider a normal person, even if you are against what Israel is doing, a normal person does not respond that way. So that would be an example where we wouldn't treat him as a ma'abed atzmo ladas.
Are you saying that nowadays the reality of life is different than when Yeshua was writing, or it sounds like we don't it's way too difficult of a din to follow, and therefore we basically just overrode it?
Well, that is a possibility. I don't want to analyze halacha that way, although I'm not denying that that would apply. It could very well be that, maybe I wouldn't say it's too difficult of a din to follow, but maybe it's too difficult of a din to determine what the actual facts are. Meaning, there may be certain areas of halacha that are so difficult to really understand the dynamics that we err on the side of leniency in that situation. That might be what's going on.
Does that impact how we view a person after the person themselves, not as opposed to their action?
Well, remember, the Sefer Hasidim is not legitimating the action. The Sefer Hasidim is not saying you're allowed to commit suicide if you're depressed. The Sefer Hasidim, by definition, is excusing the person, but not legitimating the action. The action is sinful. The action is a ma'isa avera, but people are not fully responsible for every avera that they do. By the way, this is a whole other thing, and we can give a whole talk on suicide and all of those issues, because there are two suicides that are recorded in Tanakh, apparent suicides. One is the suicide of Shimshon, where Shimshon pulls down the building to kill the Philistines, knowing that he's going to die in that process. And the second suicide is that of Shaul HaMelech at the end of the book of Shmuel, where Shaul was struck by the Plishtim, and he asked his arms bearer to stick him with a sword, and the arms bearer refused, and Shaul fell on his sword, apparently killing himself. Now, interestingly enough, that's the end of Shmuel Aleph. The beginning of Shmuel Beis describes a different way that Shaul died. An Amalekite ger, what on earth is an Amalekite ger? But anyway, shows up to David HaMelech and says, I take credit, Shaul was dying. He figures David's going to like him. I take credit, Shaul was dying, and I took a sword and I killed him. And of course, David had him killed. Okay, so putting aside the contradiction between Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Beis, huh?
What about Achitophel?
Achitophel, yeah, you're correct. There's more than that. Achitophel committed suicide. Yeah, you are correct. Achitophel did commit suicide as well. I guess what I meant was there are two people that we regard as tzaddikim who committed suicide. Achitophel was Baalal Russia, so it's less of a problem. So how do you understand Shaul's suicide? So Shimshon's suicide we can understand as the suicide of a soldier. I mean, let's put it this way. When I go into battle, right, so I'm endangering my life to be matzil my people. So one could look at Shimshon the same way. He is essentially killing himself to kill the enemies of the Jewish people. So that's how you could understand the Shimshon suicide. What exactly is the Shaul suicide? So again, there are many different opinions. Some opinions just apply to Sefer Hasidim. He was mentally ill, and therefore he's not responsible for his actions, which means it wasn't mutter, but he's not responsible for what he does, and therefore he goes to Olam Haba, as the Medrash says. Others say that Shaul was afraid that he would be captured alive by the Philistines and tortured to worship Avodah Zarah. And this gets us into a fascinating issue that was relevant during the Crusades. If I'm mechuyev to give up my life before I worship idols, what if I'm afraid I'm going to be tortured and I will worship idols? Can I take my life? And this was halacha l'maisa during the Crusades, and some understand Shaul that way. So that's a whole other issue of suicide. And then you get into the Samim Rosh, which talks about what you might call medical euthanasia. Can a person take his life if he's suffering extreme tortures? We paskin not, but there are some shittas that say yes. So suicide is a complicated topic, but halacha l'maisa, after the fact, we tend to go with Sefer Hasidim. By the way, another thing about suicide to be aware of, that very often attempted suicides are actually calls for help, meaning the person is hoping it won't be successful, that people will get him before. There was a famous British poet, Sylvia Plath, who died of suicide. But the story goes, she was always like taking pills and going to the hospital, and etc. And the story goes that she had a cleaning lady who came in every Tuesday at 1. That was the thing. She came in every Tuesday when she had a key. So Sylvia Plath took her pills at 12, expecting the cleaning lady, this is how they reconstruct it, to show up at 1 and get her to the hospital. And around 12:15, when she was already unconscious, the cleaning lady called and said she won't be able to come until 2. So by the time she came, Sylvia Plath was already dead, even though she never intended to kill herself. Now, the interesting question halachically would be, so if we knew those facts, would that bichlal be called a suicide? Or no, there was no intention to kill yourself. You thought you'd be found. So perhaps bichlal, that's not a ma'amed atzmo, ladas. I don't know what the halacha would be. Yeah.
I also came with questions about forgiving other people. I didn't plan this. The broadly speaking question is, when must a person forgive? And I've heard, when is a person absolutely mechuyev to forgive another person?
Yeah.
I've heard many things. One, if the person doesn't forgive when the guy asks 3 times, the person is forgiven. If the person is dead and the guy comes and asks forgiveness at the grave, the guy's forgiven. I heard if Reuven doesn't forgive Shimon, then Hashem won't forgive Reuven, but I think the Rav answered that kind of in reverse in a nice way. Sorry, two more. I also heard all of Israel is one soul in the afterlife, so if Reuven doesn't forgive Shimon, Hashem's punishing Shimon, then Reuven's going to feel it. So now, Reuven should have forgiven. And are certain acts considered unforgivable? Verbal, sexual, physical abuse? And, lastly, is a Jew mechuyev to ask forgiveness from a goy, and is a goy chayav to give forgiveness to?
Yeah, so in terms of the obligation to forgive, the Rambam in Hilchos Shuvah writes exactly that the person asked 3 times, or the person got a minyan by the grave of the person that he hurt that's no longer alive. And the Rambam indeed says, when you're mechuyev to be mochel and you're not mochel, you get the Aveira. Now, what's interesting is, though, that this idea of 3 times is not perfunctory. It doesn't mean I walk by you and say, mochel me, etc. We're talking about sincerity, which you have the right to gauge, even though you never know. And therefore, we cannot say you violated your chiyuv unless you actually know that this person is sincere. Are there Aveiros that are so severe that they are unforgivable? I believe not. I believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the tshuva process, forgives everything. That doesn't mean there won't be punishments in Shemayim. Even mechila does not mean there are no consequences. The consequences may be very severe, but ultimately there's mechila. Now, from a human perspective, it may be very, very, very difficult to uproot the hatred from my heart. But that's my avoda. My avoda is to work on myself so I don't have hatred and resentment. If I can't get over it, I'm an honest. It's beyond my control. Hashem will patr me if I really can't get over it. But I am mechuyev to try to get over it. They told the story that somebody, before Yom Kippur, we walk by people, say, bimochel me, we don't even wait to hear their response, bimochel me. So somebody went to Rav Lapian to ask for mechila. Rav Lapian was a great, great tzaddik. And he figured Rav would say, of course, I'm mochel you b'leiv shalei. Rav said, I have to think about it. And the person was really shocked. Rav I have to think about it. I don't know. And like 3 days later, he went to the person and said, yes, I'm mochel you. Because he didn't want mechila to be superficial and meaningless. He went through working on himself to get rid of the anger, get rid of the resentment. It's a well-known idea, both in Torah and in psychology, that forgiveness is not only a gift for the one that is being forgiven. It's a great gift for the forgiver itself. Because when you're consumed with angers and hatreds and resentments, you're kind of stuck in life. You can't move on because you're constantly consumed with negative feelings. So to be able to let go is a tremendous, tremendous bracha, right? But it's an avodah, it's work. It's not the pro forma. Listen, if what I did to you was very minor, so a minor offense can have a minor mechila. That's superficial stuff. But when things are deep, it's an avodah. It's an avodah to ask for mechila. It's an avodah to learn how to grant mechila. It's not a simple thing. Things that you work on. Revelia took a few days to work on this, and for some types of things, it may be a few years. I came across something on the internet, and it didn't come from an Orthodox source, so maybe I'm a little reluctant to mention it, but I thought it was actually very, very beautiful and moving, and I send it out to people sometimes. It was Yizkor for an abusive parent, meaning a person loses a father and mother. The father and mother abused them. But you're supposed, besides Kaddish, you're supposed to come to Shul, during the Yomim Tovim, and ask God to remember their soul for good. And how do you do that? How do you forgive them if there was horrendous abuse? So there was a nusach. That says, I hope that, I know you gave me life. I know that I'm born because of you. And I know there were mistakes. And I ask Hashem to let me go beyond the bitterness and the anger that I feel so I could become a forgiving person. Again, this is what the avodah is like, because sometimes the harm is very severe, but we have to try to move past it. And that's what mechila is ultimately about. So about a guy. So that's interesting. If you sin against, so you're asking both directions. If I sin against a guy, am I mechuyev to ask mechila? I don't see why not. Meaning the following. Many things are not sins vis-a-vis goyim. If I lent a guy money with interest, I don't have to ask mechila because I'm allowed to do that. But if the halacha prohibits your doing something to the non-Jew, then I think you would be mechuyev to ask his mechila, because you committed an avera against a non-Jew. Now, does a non-Jew have to go through this process? That I don't know for sure. I'm sorry, I think we have a raya for sure. No. We have a very clear raya that non-Jews have to ask mechila. I'll tell you the raya. Because the whole raya that you have to ask mechila is Hashem told Avimelech, who took Sarah, go to Avraham and be mafayas him. So there, I think Yutaka have an explicit raya that the non-Jew has a chayva of mechila, because it's derived from Avimelech. Huh?
The question was, is a goy chayiv under the 7 mitzvahs to forgive a Jew?
Oh, is he chayiv to forgive? Yeah. That maybe not, because when the Rambam talks about the chayiv to forgive, the Rambam says this is the derech of Yisrael, who are rachmanim, unlike the Umot HaOlam. So that's interesting. So according to what we're saying, according to what you're suggesting, it might be that if you hurt a non-Jew, you're in more trouble than if you hurt a Jew. I hurt a Jew, he has to be mochel me if I'm sincere. I hurt a non-Jew, I'm in big trouble. He doesn't have to be mochel me. Interesting question. It reminds me a little bit of a famous story with the Stipler. The Stipler once showed up at the bar mitzvah of a kid in Bnei Brak, and the family was very honored, but they didn't even know the Stipler. What is he showing us? Stipler walked 2 miles. He spoke a few words to the child, and then he trudged back another 2 miles. He was very bad health. And everybody goes to the bar mitzvah boy and says, what did he say? He says, oh, he asked my mechila. What was it? 4 years before, when the kid was 9 years old, he was davening with his Zaidi on Rosh Hashanah in the Stipler Shul, called the Letterman Shul. And the boy was carrying a big machzor that is as big as a Gemara for his grandfather. And the Stipler thought he was learning Gemara during davening. And he said to the boy, on Rosh Hashanah davening, you should concentrate on the davening, you shouldn't learn Gemara. And then he saw it was a machzor, and the Stipler said, I embarrassed you. I hurt you. I have to ask your mechila. But you're a katan. A katan cannot be mochel. So tell me your bar mitzvah. So the boy told him the Shabbos of his bar mitzvah. 4 years later, the Stipler shows up to the bar mitzvah. He walked 4 miles to ask the child's mechila. Which means, according to the Stipler, when you hurt a katan, you're in bigger trouble than when you hurt a gadol. Because a gadol can be meichel me, a katan cannot be mochel. So your chiddush is suggesting that perhaps with a non-Jew you have the same type of problem. I need to think about it, but it's a good...
Sorry, just very
Yep,
quick follow-up.
yeah.
Part of, I guess, the difficulty of the forgiveness process is the fear that Reuven punches Shimon, so now Shimon fears Reuven's going to get away with his punishment. Now, Shimon cannot take revenge. Can't punch Reuven back. And if he has to forgive, Reuven gets away with it. So I guess what I'm saying is, it just seems like not forgiving is the option to prevent Shimon from doing the Vera of punching Reuven back. Because he knows at least Hashem will take care of it, so it's justice.
Well, once again, first of all, let me point out that even after tshuva and forgiveness, there may still be punishment, meaning tshuva does not eliminate necessarily all punishments. They're still in the nature of spiritual therapy. In other words, God loves you and you're close to Hashem, but you got to pay a certain price. So there will be a sense of justice that Hashem puts into the calculus of even tshuva. The second point is, since your obligation of mechila depends on Reuven sincerely doing tshuva, so by definition, that makes the occurrence of the event much less likely, because if Reuven is likely to do it again, that means his tshuva is not sincere, and you don't have to be mochel under those circumstances. In fact, I believe the poskim say beferish that when there's a reasonably high probability that Reuven will be a repeat offender, you're not mechuyev to be mochel under those circumstances. So it only comes when there's a real change. Yeah.
I think, I'm sure the Ram says it, but I've seen it also in other people, in other Sfarim, how just like Hashem created the physical reality, Hashem also created time. And for a long time, people had a very hard time understanding what that meant, practically. And I heard that Einstein's theory of relativity basically proved that point. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I really can't, because it's a very abstract notion. What did they used to say? Einstein became, in the 1950s in particular, or the 40s and the early 50s, he became a pop celebrity. Everybody, he was like the Beatles. Everybody was following him around all over the place, and they loved to say, Professor Einstein, there's only 4 people who understand the theory of relativity. And Einstein said, I'd like to know who the other 3 are. So it's very enigmatic. But all I can say is that Einstein's yesod, which, by the way, is echoed in Moreh Nevuchim and the like. So even before Einstein, Maral, Moreh Nevuchim say it, and that is time is connected to matter. And that is, matter has dimensions of matter. There's length, width, height, and time. Zaman is the fourth dimension that depends on matter, and that's what's called the time-space continuum. That instead of looking at space and time as different things, time is connected to space, which is connected to matter. And therefore, if matter is created, that before the creation of matter, there was total nothingness, then by definition there couldn't be time. Now, we don't understand that. What do you mean there's no time? I mean, let's imagine you have an empty room. I mean, time is still passing. Okay, but there's still air, there's still, there's never total emptiness. But I don't really have a deeper understanding than that. But as I say, even the medieval philosophers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, spoke about time as a function of matter. And that's why when God created matter, God created time at the same time. Yeah.
It's by Bereshis, it says the first day is one day, and the second day is like the second day.
Second.
So is the idea that once you have diversity of things, like once you have difference, then time comes in? So it's not just that it's a property of matter, it's like a property of like differentiation of matter. That's when like time starts to maybe creep in.
Yeah, so time can only occur when there's been a flow. So only by day 2 you have time. I hear. I mean, Lamaisa, even in day 1 there was a passage of seconds, but in terms of a clear demarcation, transition point, you need a 2 for there to be a first. Yeah.
Here's another send-in. Why is it looked down upon for a yeshiva bacher or Haredi man to wear colored shoes? People wear colored suits and sweaters. Do I have to be worried about wearing shoes like this and people thinking I'm not religious?
Yeah, so the question becomes, why do people look down at people wearing colored shoes? I'm not sure what colored shoes is. If you wear green or pink, I think people will look at you, but brown, I don't know. I mean, I think this is a general question about the black and white uniform, which is so characteristic of the Haredi world. The one thing I can tell you, although I'm not specifically answering shoes that much, is that this is a relatively recent change. When I was in Ner Yisrael in the 1970s, so there were people who wore blue shirts, certainly during the week, for sure they wore colored shirts. A pink shirt, you could get a little in trouble. I don't know, pink was not considered to be so great, but blue, yellow, a striped shirt, this was perfectly acceptable. Even on Shabbos, people wore, in fact, I looked at pictures of myself. I can't believe it, the suits that I wore in the plaid and psychedelic, unbelievable. I mean, there's no way on earth that I would wear it even on Purim. But people wore it. It wasn't unusual, and people dressed that way. If you look going back further, go to the pictures of Gedolim, look at Rav Steinman, 70 years ago, whatever it is. They wore light suits, light gray or light brown, or whatever it was. That was considered to be normal. That was considered to be acceptable. The notion that black and white are the only colors is a relatively recent phenomenon. And the emes is, there's nothing intrinsically, this is not one of the 613 mitzvahs, thou shalt wear black and white. But what happens is, it's part of the polarization of the world. As the world gets more secular, more decadent, less modest in dress, so we got to become more simple, we got to become more Amish-like, just to kind of differentiate ourselves from the negativities out there. So if you're asking me a practical question, will people look at you as less religious? Unfortunately, they will. But that doesn't mean you are, meaning it depends what you're asking me. If you're asking me, am I less religious because I wear colored shoes? The answer is no, you're not less religious. Will people look at you as less religious because you're wearing colored shoes? The answer is yes, they will. But that's, once again, the disconnect between perception and reality, and the fact that we sometimes overemphasize externals over internals. Somebody, the Satmar Rebbe, who was an opponent of all sorts of things, was very, very friendly to Rav Moshe Scherer, who was the legendary head of Agudas Yisrael, although they did not agree politically on anything, including the Medina. And Rav Moshe Scherer didn't have a beard. He didn't have a beard. He was a clean-shaven person. So a chassid went to the Satmar Rebbe and said, how can you befriend a person who doesn't even have a beard? What type of person is he? He doesn't have a beard. Among Hasidim, especially, a beard is a very big thing. So the Satmar Rebbe said, I would rather be friends with a Yid without a beard than a beard without a Yid. Oh, is it Mike Tress? Okay, maybe it's Mike Tress. Okay, Mike Tress. Mike Tress was the predecessor of Rabbi Sher, but the same thing. Mike Tress did not, actually Rabbi Sher's cousin, and Mike Tress did not have a beard either. And he said, I'd rather have the Yid without the beard than the beard without the Yid. And once again, that's a very profound statement, because sometimes you can be bechitzonius, you can have all of the things, but inside there's not much there. And what is inside is more important than what is outside. So that's kind of it, yeah.
When it's said that dual loyalty is like an anti-Semitic trope that a Jew.
Yeah, dual loyalty, yeah.
So what's the response in the sense that is it incorrect to assume that there is a Torah value of patriotism towards one's country, and if there is, then how would you respond if somebody came up to you and said, well, you think this country is gullus and etc. You have due loyalty.
Yeah, that's a very good question. As you point out, the accusation of dual loyalty, that Jews are not really loyal, let's say to the United States, because their primary allegiance is to Israel, has been invoked by anti-Semites to this very day, and indeed right now it's getting stronger because of U.S. support for Israel, although that support itself is in jeopardy right now. And the question is, what does Judaism teach about the notion of loyalty to country besides Eretz Yisrael? Should I be a patriot? Should I put out an American, assuming I live in America, should I put out an American flag on the 4th of July? So Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very interesting tshuva. Moshe Feinstein, Gadol Hador, actually writes that, and he's writing about the United States, so it may depend on the country, but he's saying, a Jew has a very specific obligation to have hakaras hatov to the United States. He called it a malchus shel chesed. He called it a country of benevolence, a country that has given Jews haven, has given them opportunities. Yes, precisely because of those opportunities, there's a lot of secularism and everything else. But still, if you consider what Russia was like, what Poland was like, the Holocaust, all the people that tried to destroy us, and America, like the Statue of Liberty, it's still very moving. Written by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish woman, give me you're tired or whatever, give me you're tired, you're hungry. That was the message. I mean, there is a ruchniistic content, there is a spiritual content in the United States that's very, very significant. To be a haven for the people who were suffering, the people who were dispossessed, the people who had no place to go. And Rav Moshe Feinstein writes, we have to have hakaras hatov, and because of that, we work for the betterment of society. We vote. He said Jews had an obligation to participate in the democratic structure of the United States. Lubavitcher Rebbe, from the other side, made the same point in many, many, many ways. Now, granted that we feel gratitude to the United States, granted that we have to be good citizens, and that's besides the halacha of dina to malchusa dina, which is a halacha anyway, that doesn't fully resolve the double loyalty problem. Because yes, I try to be a good American, I stand by my country, but I still have to recognize that I'm in Golus, and Eretz Yisrael is my ultimate destination. So that's going to create problems where the interests of Israel and the best interests of the United States do not always correspond. Now, I know the standard apologetic is, well, what's good for Israel will always be good for America because they're our only democratic ally, and therefore there'll never be a contradiction. I honestly don't know if that's true. And the emes is, if it came to a stira between Eretz Yisrael and America, I think you have to go with Eretz Yisrael. So I hate to concede the anti-Semitic point, but I think ultimately, and maybe it'll be rare because it is true that a lot of times a strong Israel is better for the U.S. But I'm not going to say that 100% of the time. So the dual loyalty thing is still kind of a little bit of a problem. But I think, Baruch Hashem, it'll only be in very rare cases. one could debate, okay, again, I don't want to get into, one might debate the contemporary situation. And it's not a frivolous question. Israel has to do what it's doing because we have to destroy this poison. Is it in the best interest of the United States beyond a certain point? I think a very good argument could be made that it is. And then, Baruch Hashem, you don't have a stira. But maybe at some point it's not going to be, So the question is not as anti-Semitic necessarily as you might think. But nevertheless, generally, Rav Moshe does talk about patriotism for your home country. And I'll tell you this, those of you that have parents or grandparents, by now it's grandparents probably, who survived the Holocaust or who came from persecuted environments, you will tend to see that they tend to be patriotic people because they know what it's like to live under oppression, and they're grateful. We who were born in freedom, we don't appreciate it as much, right? So the 4th of July person will tend to be the immigrants who came from the Soviet Union or a Holocaust survivor as opposed to the native born. By the way, Zionism is the same thing. I mean, the Israeli that's born here often has less appreciation because, hey, they're just born here. Israel is Israel. Yeah?
I'm wondering if the Rav has anything to say about a healthy way to deal with guilt one may feel about things he or her may have done in the past.
In other words, a healthy way to deal with guilt.
Yeah.
Guilt because of things that were done in the past.
Yeah.
Well, a little bit of guilt is not a bad thing, but it can become paralyzing, it can become excessive, and then it becomes the Yetzer Hara, meaning the Meforshim say, all of the Musar Sfarim say, that there are two Yetzer Haras. There's the Yetzer Hara that causes me to sin, and then there's the Yetzer Hara that makes me feel so guilty and so worthless that I never have the energy to make myself a better person. And that second Yetzer Hara is worse than the first Yetzer Hara. Because the Yetzer Hara of sin, once I do the sin, all right, that's over. But the Yetzer Hara that I'm worthless and I'm no good and I'm guilty, that can continue your whole life. So you have to understand that that's a Yetzer Hara that you have to overcome. And you do so by internalizing the message of tshuva. Tshuva says, God forgives. God forgives me. He wants me to move on. He wants me to become a better person. He will enable me to be a better person. And if God forgives me, I have to forgive myself. Do I think I'm smarter than Hashem? Do I think I'm better than Hashem? Do I know better than God? God says, you're forgiven. So what am I doing by not forgiving myself? Now, I know that's easy to say, and it's harder to do. I understand that. But you tell yourself that over and over and over and over again. And you know that it's true. It is a true message. And after all, let me point out another thing. I don't know your situation, but, how bad were you? If somebody, was a mass murderer of 5,000 people, I could understand maybe their whole life they're going to be racked with guilt. But typically we do Averos, we didn't know the halacha, we didn't have the background, we didn't have the chinuch. We're not so guilty, we're not so bad. Yeah, we made mistakes, we got to correct it. But we're not mass murderers. And we shouldn't paint ourselves as if we are mass murderers. So you kind of think about things in those terms, and then you go on. Now, the downside is that I don't mean to imply that you shouldn't take Averos seriously. I understand that you might say, I'm just saying, just forget about it. No, you have to be mischaretz over your sins, but don't let it paralyze you, because then it becomes destructive. Then it's the Yetzer Hara. That's a from Yetzer Hara, in which you're thinking about your Averos. Don't think about it. Go on. Rabbeinu Yonah writes that part of doing tshuva is to look at each day, as the saying goes, the first day of the rest of your life. Like, don't think about your past that much. Yeah.
What are the constraints of dina in terms of how anti-Semitic the government is? Because I've heard that people don't realize that the idea of dina was formulated in Bavli, which is a very anti-Semitic government, and it could be argued that every single government in history until America was anti-Semitic. I've heard stories that Rav Moshe in Luban didn't take money that was sent to him without like without knowledge of the government because he felt that it was illegal to do so. So like, I don't think anyone would say that we would have to follow like Nazi decrees. Like where exactly is that?
Yeah, so again, this is a difficult question. We have this rule, dina de malchus dina, a Torah observant Jew must follow the secular laws of the government. So if I evade my income taxes, I'm not just violating U.S. law or Israeli law, I'm violating the halacha of dina de malchus dina. And yet there is a concept in the Rishonim that the phrase malchusa connotes what you might call a legitimate government, and not simply a government that has no legitimacy, like a bunch of bandits called chamsanusa, they're just thieves. And one of the elements in the cheshbon of legitimacy is, do they particularly discriminate against Jews? Do they treat Jews different than other citizens, anti-Semitic? And that might deprive their laws, at least their anti-Semitic laws, so that might be their anti-Semitic laws of any type of validity. In fact, this was a teretz I once gave, and Baruch Hashem, I heard Rav Yaakov Kanazi give the same teretz. You know, dina de malchus dina has many different aspects, but the one thing that for sure it applies to is taxes. That's the one core situation. And there are a lot of businesses, particularly in New York and the frum world, that are basement businesses, cash-only businesses, in which no sales tax is paid. And the question is it a violation of halacha? Well, l'chayre it is, dina de malchus dina. And for you to patronize the store might even be lifnei iver, you're causing them not to pay sales tax. So the question is, why do so many frum Jews do it? So I once posited as a speculative theory that they say, hey, my grandfather had a store in Russia and he never paid any taxes. So what are you telling me? My grandfather wasn't, frum enough? He was a tzaddik. So it's minhag avoseinu. I'm following the minhag of my family. You don't pay taxes. But the difference was, in Russia, Tsarist Russia, anti-Semitic taxes, you weren't mechuyev to pay. You come to the United States where it's equality. You see that. So Baruch Hashem, I heard Dr. Kamenetsky said the same thing. He said people are making a mistake to apply the rules of Tsarist Russia to a democratic government. Now, in the case of Moshe, it could very well be that legabe those laws which were not discriminatory bedafka against Jews, you are mechayiv. It's only the discriminatory aspect. Now, there are people who go totally, they go crazy over this and they say, well, everything is anti-Semitic. The American government is anti-Semitic. The court system is biased against Jews. The police department is against Jews. They basically see, and again, individual people are anti-Semitic. I'm not denying that. But to then say the whole system is biased against Jews, I think is a massive overstatement. And generally speaking, in a normal democratic system, there would be the chiyuv of dina de malchus dina. Yeah.
I was given the understanding that the Kabbalah that was given over is kind of, the Kabbalists are taking from what was given to the prophets, and that's kind of God's science that was gifted to man about how the world works. If that statement is true, then how could it be that we have any arguments about this? And if you want to say the arguments came of confusion, then the books should no longer be trustworthy because things are only one.
Yeah, so the issue is Kabbalah, the mystical doctrines of Kabbalah. So you're saying that these are ultimately visions that were revealed to the prophets, who then communicated them, and then they got articulated in various ways. And the question then becomes, well, if these come down from the prophets, Hashem showed the prophets, the Nevi'im, certain things. How could there be machloksim? How could there be arguments between the Ari and the Ramak and the Leshem, whatever it is? If it all came down as a prophecy from a unitary source, then machlokas by definition would be somebody's wrong or somebody misunderstood and the like, and doesn't that cast illegitimacy on everything? It is a good question, but again, I'm not sure that the premise is totally accurate. On one hand, the very word Kabbalah, received tradition, does suggest a body of doctrine that was handed down. But once again, by analogy to the halacha portion, where Torah Shabbat Peh was really a small group of principles that are then amplified and developed and debated. Kabbalah underwent the very same process. So it's not the pshat that the Arizal is simply passing down something that was received from other generations, but rather taking that framework of reality, he elaborates, he interprets it. Now the question then becomes, so nobody is distorting the Kabbalah, but there are differences in interpretation. Now the question still is, so does that mean one is right and one is wrong? That's a complicated question. All I can tell you is the Arizal himself said, the Lurianic Kabbalah is very different than Cordoverian Kabbalah. We can't get into the differences now. And generally speaking, most people understand that the Ari had a higher level of revelation than the Ramak, and therefore the Ramak's Kabbalah is no longer relevant. The Ari brought us to a new perception. The Arizal B'dafka said that was not emes. The Arizal basically said that reality can be viewed, this is very abstract, through multiple and conflicting prisms of reality. And on one level of reality, Ramak is right. On other levels of reality, Ari is right. And you're dealing with simultaneous, well, again, in modern physics, we talk about multiverses. Universes, multiverses. It's a similar idea of parallel, huh?
We are on one of the even if the sciences work differently.
No, but you have to understand that Kabbalah, by and large, is not describing this world. Kabbalah is describing Atzilus. Kabbalah is describing higher levels of divinity, and at that level, you are talking about a multiverse type of idea. Kabbalah is not describing this world. In fact, it usually kind of stops before it gets here. It's kind of discussing Atzilus and Bria. So I know I might not be making any sense here because it's something that's beyond our comprehension, but the basic idea is that there are simultaneous realities based on interpretations of what the Nevi'im saw, and all of them, huh?
The interpretation will create a new reality, or because that would be...
That's possible. That is possible. I know that's a more daring idea. We know in halacha it works that way. In halacha it actually does work that way. God will be maskim. The question is...
reality, not in a different one.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know. That I don't know how far that could go. But that's why, just historically, the Ramak's Kabbalah, which supposedly was superseded by the Arizal, continued to be used by the Balatanya and many, many others as well, and they did it side by side with the Arizal. So apparently these multiple realities were said to exist. Yeah.
I'm sure we know yesterday were the Israeli elections.
Yeah.
And obviously there are many different ideas and cholesterol, especially in Israeli society, Zionism and anti-Zionism, and the Haredi parties and all that. But I heard from many of them that were saying about the Haredi parties that you're being Makabel of Nachal Shemayim and it's Kiddushim Shemayim and all that if you do vote, because you're making a big difference. But we did see that there are many different Haredi parties, there's Shas and other ones, and we see that many of them they go back and forth with each other, they rip down each other's signs and one is better than the other. So is there a difference if it's the same Avodah Hashem, I guess, according to them, like if I vote for any Haredi party, what difference does it make if I vote for Shas or whatever it is?
Yeah, politics. It's hard to talk about this. I grew up in the United States, and the Gedolim of my youth were Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Yitzchak Hutner, Rav Shner Kotler, my own Rosh Hashiva later, Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman. And, those are kind of my Gedolim, so to speak. I know people talk about the good old days. I know it's nostalgia, but of older people, but whatever. And I didn't recall, now maybe I didn't know, maybe I wasn't so knowledgeable, but I didn't recall, them issuing orders and directives how you have to vote in various elections. It was understood that people made their own decisions and the like. Now, there is a good reason to differentiate Eretz Yisrael from Chutz La'aretz. In other words, I'm not saying that notion of hands-off, laissez-faire should automatically apply here. Because here, the government is involved in the religious life in terms of money and in terms of restrictions and limitations, in terms of draft. So maybe there is more of a justification to tell people these are the parties you should vote for. But as I say, it's personally always very distasteful to me that we have to be so involved in politics. As a general rule, Rav Kamenetsky would encourage people to be independent in life, that not everything is a shaila. You're not told what to do. In fact, he decried what he called the chassidification of Litvish Torah life, in which, like a chassid, you got to go to a rebbe for every little thing. So it doesn't sit well with me. But in terms of your specific question, if you vote for a Haredi party, even if it's not the recommendation of your group, are you serving Hashem properly? I would think yes. I would look at the agendas, meaning to say, I would look at what are the important issues as a religious person that are important. And if this party does it or that party does it, l'may nafka mina, it's still going to be, it'll still get done, or not get done, depending as it were. So I see less of an importance that it be Gimel or Shas than that it should be, there should be a religious input in government mental decision making.
The whole politics is just magdil against yours?
I didn't hear, say it?
The whole politics is just magdil against yours, that's what it sounds like.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to comment. I mean, again, there are a lot of things that I just am not masking to myself, but who am I? Maybe my opinion is no better, or maybe a lot worse than opinion of people who are greater than me. But do you remember I told the story a few weeks ago, I don't know if it was here, about the Panovich Rav, that he was there to collect money in Chicago, and there was a Meshulach from the Novardiker Yeshiva who was there, and the Novardiker Meshulach thought, I'm going to get nothing today because the Panovich Rav is a spellbinding speaker. And at the end of his speech, the Panovich Rav said, please give all your money to the other guy. And when the person said, well, Rebbe, I'm so grateful, but how could you give me all the money that's for your yeshiva? The Panovich Rav said, I don't know what you mean, my yeshiva. We're all working for Torah. What's the difference if the money goes to Novardik or to Panovich? What's the difference? 20 people can learn with this money. I don't care what base medrash they're sitting in. This is the Panovich Rav. There's a lot of wisdom there. Do I care if it's Shas or Degel or Torah? What do I care? I want there to be a religious input that the needs of the Haredi population are being met, are being addressed. So let it be this, let it be that. Why does it got to be a specific person? So I think you do have room to make judgment there. Okay, maybe we have to start. One more question, yeah.
What's the deal with the Bible codes?
The Bible codes. Oh, yeah. Well, maybe I'll have to address it next week. I think it's questionable. I would not rest my faith in God and Torah on the Bible codes. There's some things that look impressive, but other experts say it's not impressive. So it's very hard for me to gauge probability sciences, not being an expert in probability, meaning their argument, I'll tell you the problem. The problem is that we haven't yet, and it's impossible, we haven't yet used the Bible codes to predict an event that hasn't happened yet. Meaning the way the Bible codes, because you don't know what to look for, right? Like Yogi Berra once said, we can never know the future because it hasn't happened yet. That's what it is. So the only thing the Bible codes can show is, if I look in Amalek, I can find Hitler and I can find this and I can find that. Meaning the Bible codes can only be used to show that things that have already happened were predicted. But they haven't been used to predict a future event that hasn't happened. I think if they ever find a way to do that, that would be really, really proof. But when you're looking for something, I think by definition you run into random probabilities. Some people claim, and again, I can't evaluate this. You can take any knob, you can take Gone with the Wind, and find encoded messages. So I'm a little reluctant. That's why in Or Sameach in particular, not just me, I think none of our Rebbeim here particularly use the Bible codes because there may be some holes in it. But still, if you're scientifically inclined, mathematically inclined, examine it and come to your conclusions. Now, the yesod of the Bible codes, that in the biblical text, all of the future events of history are revealed, I absolutely accept. That is almost an article of faith that many, many Sifrei Kabbalah say. So the notion of encoding is an absolutely valid notion, but whether you can prove its validity from the things that you found, I think is open to question. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you, and Hatzlachem.